I'm Chloe. I'm going to be interviewing Bob. He is a fellow neighbor of mine. Let's get started.
Bob, you want to know how old I am?
Yes. How old were you? Where were you? And what were you doing during the 1950s and 1960s?
Well, in 1954, we moved here, okay? My wife and I, she's in the other room. She's not very mobile. She's in a wheelchair, so she's not coming here.
Okay.
We moved here in 54, in this small portion of the house. In 64, we built that second part, which made the house quite a bit bigger. We have 3 daughters. They all went to Laidlaw School. They all went to McClure. They all went to South Campus. They all went to North Campus. And they all went to University of Illinois.
Interesting. What do you remember about Martin Luther King at the time?
Martin Luther King was well thought of by black people, and he had unlimited support. And I would say 1/3 of non-African people disliked him. 2/3 of them liked him. Do you know you're going to remember all this, or you're not writing it down?
We're videoing it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Videoing. Oh. All right.
What do you remember about the Civil Rights Movement? Do you remember anything?
Well, Civil Rights Movement, that's over a long period of time. It's like 30 years, you know, maybe it's older than your mother, probably your grandparents could be. The reason what it was, if at one time in the southern states at least, if you were a Negro or an African of African descent, you could not vote. They did not allow you to vote. You were not considered an adequate citizen to vote. This was changed. A lot of it was helped by Martin Luther King and others. He's not the only one.
Cool. What do you remember about President Kennedy at the time?
Well, President Kennedy was well thought of. He was overwhelmingly voted over and above his opposition. And of course he was assassinated. People say he was assassinated in this is a fact, in Texas, but how it was done or who done it or in what way, that I think is somewhat mysterious.
Did you have an opinion about him? Like, did you like him?
I thought he was a good president. How he would have turned out, we don't know. There was a TV over there on the other side, and I was working nights at the time, and at about 2:30 in the afternoon, it says there has been a shooting that involved the president, and that later on they said he died. His wife was there with him, and it was a horrible shock for the country.
Do you remember where you were when it happened?
Right there.
Right here?
Right there. Yeah, he had a TV over there. This was before the addition, so the TV was here.
Sorry. What were your thoughts about the Vietnam War?
I thought it was a horrible, and to this day is a horrible waste of money, of lives, and very unnecessary, including today.
Did you support it, or?
No, I did not.
No. Well, I guess
I'm a veteran of World War II, and I was in no way involved in this. In fact, I was in the reserves. I was trained as a as an aviator and as an aerial gunner. And when I was a sergeant. The pay at that time was like $130, which was very high. Most soldiers just got $50. I got $130 because of this. I was on flying status, and lo and behold, it pooped out in May, and in June, the conflict on the Korean Peninsula started. So I wasn't involved. And some goofy lieutenant from what was called at the time, I can't remember the name. It was not O'Hare, it was something else. But anyway, some lieutenant called up and says, "Sergeant, why didn't you report for duty?" I said, "Who are you calling sergeant? I'm not in the military anymore. I was discharged and I have the." "Well, send me your discharge paper." "Sir," I says, "I'll send you nothing. Get your record straight here. And maybe because of confused people like you, that's why I'm not in the military."
Were you directly involved in any protests?
Was I involved in what?
Were you directly involved in any protests?
Protest? No, I was not.
Okay.
Well, we voted in opposition to a lot of things, but not that we didn't go out carrying a fine or anything like that. No.
Did you think the Berlin Wall was good or bad?
I think it was bad, and I think it was good when it was knocked down. It was it's like if they put a wall right smack through the middle of Chicago, and like that, and surround counties, some to the south, some to the north, and it solved nothing.
Do you remember anything about the Red Scare?
About the Red Scare?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that was what it was were people like the senator from Wisconsin who was calling this a communist uprising, an attempt to take over the government of the United States by the communists, which I think was a totally wrong every way. I can't remember his name offhand. He eventually was voted out of the Senate because of his standing. He was a little irrational.
If you could change one thing about that time period, what would it be?
I don't know the question.
If you could change one thing about that time period, what would you change? Or would you not change anything?
What could be changed at that time? Well, that's a tough question. It covers this much area. What could I change about that time? Well, one of the things was to discipline the senator from Wisconsin who was selling all sorts of goofy ideas of his own, and he eventually was voted out of the Senate. This should have done sooner because he created a lot of problems during his short tenure in the United States Senate.
Do you think a lot has changed from then to now?
About what? Politically?
Sure, yeah, politically.
Well,
Or rather
I don't
just in
think
general.
people are quite as afraid of communism as they were at that time. It's something you have to be concerned about, but you don't go off half-cocked the way it was with the good senator from Wisconsin. He said I think there's something like 70 communists in the United States government, and he didn't know what he was talking about. He just said it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's interesting because my next question is, what did you think about communism?
Well, communism, generally speaking, is a inferior form of government. Okay, the communist countries, generally speaking, the people and the government don't do as well as people who have, like the United States or England or France, or in the case that I know of is in the Czech Republic. Uh, Usually what happens is it's taken over by people who want to abuse the country, or it ends up abusing the country. Of course, a good example I think is Cuba.
Um, were you in the military or drafted to it?
I was in the U.S. Army Air Corps.
Mhm.
If you want, I still have the uniform.
Ooh, cool. What kind of music did you like?
Uh, Mostly classical, polkas, dance music, something like that. My wife and I, and well, of course, a lot of other, I do like to dance, and so that's dance music. See.
Um, do you remember the first moon landing?
The first what?
The first moon landing, Apollo.
Yes. First moon landing. Yes.
Mhm.
One man landed on it. The other two, I guess, were just like support.
Mhm. Do you remember? What do you remember, or do you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Of John F. Kennedy.
The Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was according to some sources, at least, there were ballistic missiles in Cuba, and they of course posed a serious danger to the United States. I don't know if it was, I'm not that well informed about it. I don't know whether they really were or not, but they were of Russian origin. So it looks like, yes, they would have been very bad for the United States if they would. See, that's only, 60 miles away from the United States
Mhm.
soil. But I mean, they could have sent them to some of the larger cities in Florida or New Orleans, or the southern Nashville, southern cities. Not so much New York or Chicago, Denver, because they're far away.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for talking with me today. That is unfortunately all I can ask you, but I would like to learn more. Thanks. Bye.
Okay.